In the lead up to the launch of a new mainline Final Fantasy game, when the marketing campaign starts to ramp up and show more gameplay, a certain type of discourse begins to permeate across the fanbase like clockwork. It happens every time, and much of the content remains the same, to the chagrin of people who know better. The discourse of what a real or true Final Fantasy game is. I've seen it on and off for many years now, and it isn't getting any less tiring. It's not necessarily a train of discussion that's limited to just Final Fantasy either. Any franchise that's been around anywhere close to as long will undoubtedly have its own fair share of pedantic, spurned fans constructing lists of arbitrary requirements as to what would make the new game in their favorite series a real series game. In fact, I already discussed this very thing for survival horror games in another video. The link will be in the description. But something about Final Fantasy specifically makes this topic particularly contentious. A non-insignificant amount of people become downright combative when a new Final Fantasy game doesn't tick every single box on their list of rigidly traditional attributes. But is that really fair to the series? Is a strict criteria powered by experiences of the past indicative of a fan who knows better than the creators? Or is it an unwitting admission that they're not as knowledgeable as they think they are and are simply trying to pass off desperate nostalgia or misaimed talking points as a greater knowledge of the Final Fantasy identity? In this video, I want to cover the mainline Final Fantasy series and directly discuss a lot of complaints that vocal fans, or former fans, seem to have about the long-running franchise, particularly in relation to the series' ever-changing gameplay and setting, and the continually controversial and misunderstood involvement of one particular director and character designer. I want to go into detail about what makes a Final Fantasy game a real Final Fantasy, if such an idea even exists. But I also want to make this video accessible to those who only have a passing experience or understanding of the franchise, especially those who might have played only one or two specific games and know little about the others. In order to do that effectively, I'll need to provide a lot of context for the whole series, which means a history lesson. If you're already intimately familiar with the mainline series, and I mean intimately, feel free to skip ahead to the What is Real Final Fantasy section of the video. The chapter timestamps will be in the description. Also, a quick disclaimer. I am a big Final Fantasy fan, but I would not go so far as to say that I'm any kind of authority on the franchise. I am not a walking encyclopedia. I've never worked as a developer on any game, and I've never held any interviews with developers either. So while I do feel pretty strongly about this topic, I am ultimately just a guy sharing his perspective. I am not trying to force anyone to like anything. If you don't enjoy real-time combat or modern settings in the franchise, that's fine. I'm not trying to change your mind on that. I am only challenging the idea that the stringent criteria of a real Final Fantasy is very arbitrary and antithetical to the franchise's true spirit. So, to start, let's go back in time to the 80s, where gaming was still in its infancy, and Japanese developers and publishers were beginning to make a big splash in the industry. In May of 1986, the Japanese game publisher Enix launched an RPG for the Nintendo Entertainment System developed by Chunsoft, titled Dragon Quest. Contrary to what you may assume right now, its initial sales were actually not that high. In fact, Enix expected the game to bomb and ultimately lose them money. However, a series of articles featured in the hyper-popular Shonen Jump magazine, written by Dragon Quest lead designer Yuji Horii, attracted the attention of many soon-to-be fans, leading to a sales resurgence for the game, and it snowballed from there. Many people immediately became admirers of Akira Toriyama's character designs and Koichi Sugiyama's music. It would go on to be a financial and critical success, even earning numerous end-of-year awards from Famitsu magazine. Since then, the Dragon Quest franchise has grown to become one of the most beloved intellectual properties in Japan. Every time a new mainline entry is launched, it's practically considered a national holiday over there, with the most recent title, 11, selling over 2 million physical copies in the first 2 days. The release of the first Dragon Quest is thus considered a gigantic turning point in the entire history of the video game industry, creating a brand new template that Japanese-developed RPGs would follow for years to come. To say that it attracted the attention of other developers and publishers would simply be stating the obvious. And one of those publishers was Square. Director Hironobu Sakaguchi had been seeking permission from Square executives to begin development on a turn-based RPG, but he had been rebuffed under the assumption that such a game would end up being a commercial failure for the company. However, with the success of Dragon Quest, a new faith was born in the genre, and he was finally given the go-ahead to begin his project. At first, only 3 other colleagues volunteered to join his seemingly ill-fated journey. But soon his team grew to 7 core members, including other talented lead designers Koichi Ishii and Akitoshi Kawazu, the latter of whom was tasked with developing the battle system, which was heavily inspired by the Dungeons & Dragons tabletop RPG and the Wizardry video game series. Other crucial and later legendary team members were writer Kenji Terada, character designer Yoshitaka Amano, composer Nobuo Uematsu, and programmer Nasir Gebeli. Finally, on December 18, 1987, Final Fantasy launched in Japan for the NES. The classical fantasy adventure began by allowing players to choose 4 characters to make up their party by assigning an occupation for each team member, either fighter, black belt, thief, black mage, white mage, or red mage, which is then locked in for the remainder of the game. This team is dubbed the Warriors of Light, and they embark on a quest to bring balance back to the 4 elemental crystals which protect the world: Earth, Fire, Water, and Wind. Simultaneously, they must overcome the sinister machinations of Rogue Knight Garland and the dark entity simply known as Chaos. The party travels across plains, forests, deserts, swamps, caves, and cities to accomplish their goal in this very traditional narrative of swords, monsters, and magic. It's a pretty standard tale of the triumph of good over evil, but it was more than enough to create a compelling, interactive experience and set the stage for the franchise. The gameplay was made up of 4 key parts: the overworld, which was a scaled-down version of the game's setting that facilitated more abbreviated travel between major locations; town and dungeon maps, which were normally scaled areas that featured NPCs to talk to or enemies to encounter; the battle screen, which is where combat took place; and menus. The combat in Final Fantasy is menu-based in itself, being a turn-based game, and a very traditional one at that. Whenever it's a character's turn, you have the option of selecting a physical melee attack, a magic spell among whatever that character has learned, or an item in your inventory to use. Of course, you don't always have to do damage to the enemy on your turn. You can heal or buff your teammates as well. The battle progresses until one side either dies or flees. Now, some of you may be wondering, how is the pace or order of a battle determined in this turn-based system? Well, it's somewhat influenced by each party member's and enemy's speed stat, sometimes called agility. However, because all actions are decided first and then executed after the commitment is made, the speed stat does not dictate the number of times a participant in the battle has a turn, but instead how soon their turn happens in the exchange. Final Fantasy would go on to be well received by critics and see noteworthy commercial success, shipping over 500,000 copies in Japan alone. In 1994, 7 years after its release, Square would state it sold over 600,000 copies total in Japan and 700,000 in America, adding up to a fantastic 1.3 million figure. This is especially impressive considering that internal numbers suggested that only 400,000 sales were needed to get a sequel greenlit. And this is only the original NES version of the game. These stats do not include the MSX2 version, which included graphical updates, expanded music, and shorter load times, or the bundled Final Fantasy 1 and 2 release that came out later. Thus, production started on the sequel immediately after the prosperous launch. But there was one small issue. There were no established ideas for what the sequel was even going to be. But this didn't stop Sakaguchi, who of course returned to continue his passionate involvement. The goal was to first create a narrative, then build the gameplay around it. Many other team members returned to work on Final Fantasy II, including Terada, Uematsu, Amano, and Ghibelli. They were hit with a tiny snag when Ghibelli was forced to return to Sacramento, California because his work visa in Japan had expired. But all was not lost, as the rest of the development team relocated to Sacramento with him in order to finish production on the game. Truly ride or die homies. Final Fantasy II released in Japan on December 17, 1998, only 1 day shy of a full year since the release of its predecessor, boasting both mechanical and narrative changes. It was the first game in the series to give default names to playable characters, with the main protagonist being called Firion. It also introduced the word memory system, where the player could talk to NPCs and upon learning specific words or phrases, recall them later when talking to different people to gain new information about a task or unlock new abilities. Similarly, there was an interactive mechanic where you could show NPCs specific items or use said items in particular circumstances to make progress. It's a simple system that doesn't seem all that special today, but back in 1988, it was pretty new and interesting. But the biggest plot difference between 2 and 1 is the simple fact that 2 has absolutely no ties to its predecessor at all. It's set in a totally different world with a totally different cast. The fact that it was titled Final Fantasy at all was more to suggest a spiritual or conceptual connection instead of a more obvious and tangible one. And as the cherry on top, 2 was the introduction of the Sid name, as well as gaming's favorite giant rideable chickens, chocobos. In regard to gameplay, the foundation was still largely the same. There was an overworld and dungeons with random encounters. There was a battle screen you would be taken to once the battle started, and you could attack, cast magic, or use items. And you gave orders to your party and they would act them out in a sequence determined by their speed stat. Same old, same old. However, there was still one major change to character development. You no longer leveled up your characters by collecting experience points and reaching a certain threshold. Now, each character develops their stats depending entirely on how you use them in fights. For example, characters who use swords and attack physically all the time will increase their strength, and characters who cast magic frequently gain magic power and learn more potent versions of the spells they cast the most. Even HP and MP grow this way, often by being given to characters who constantly end fights with barely any left. This was a big change and allowed people to decide and commit to specific roles for specific characters right away, but it was still a shockingly large departure from what the last entry did. Only 2 games into the series, and they already got rid of levels and XP. Pretty jarring. But there's also one small but impactful mechanic added to battles as well: the back row. In the previous game, it was just the command order that determined the likelihood of a character being targeted by an enemy's attacks. The sooner a party member went, the more likely the enemy was going to hit them. However, with the new row system in 2, the player is able to protect magic and ranged characters by placing them in the back row so they would be immune to most attacks. However, you also need at least one character in the front row where they can deal melee damage, but will also be targeted more often. Thus, a common strategy is to simply place your tankiest characters with the highest defense or most HP in the front row and have magic and bow users in the back, safely pelting enemies from a distance. It was a small but meaningful way of adding greater strategy to the combat, and it would remain a staple mechanic for several more entries. Just like its predecessor, Final Fantasy II would see success, critically and financially, in its home country of Japan, selling 800,000 copies of its original NES version. Sadly, there are no North American sales figures to speak of because the game just didn't release there. It wasn't until 2003 that Final Fantasy II made its way over in the form of the Final Fantasy Origins Collection for the PlayStation 1, which was a bundle of the first two games, featuring upgraded graphics, a remixed soundtrack, FMV sequences, and art galleries. It also saw a major overhaul in its PSP version. Funnily enough, it wasn't until the game was re-released with these versions that it saw more divisive reception. The original NES release reviewed extremely well in Japan, but as time went on and more people looked at the game retrospectively, 2 would go down as one of the weakest entries in the series. To go even further with this, 2 also has the lowest lifetime sales among the first 10 entries in the mainline series, despite still being considered a success. In a lot of ways, the game was a walking contradiction. With 2 now out in the wild and becoming a clear hit at the time though, Sakaguchi continued to strike while the iron was hot, and moved on to the production of Final Fantasy III, with his usual teammates Terada, Amano, Uematsu, and Ghibelli. In Ghibelli's case, however, this would be the last Final Fantasy he would work on. Much like Final Fantasy II, 3 was its own unique story that had no relation to previous games. But again, Final Fantasy III sought to reinvigorate the gameplay formula by adding a key system that the game would go on to be popular for: the job change system. 3 brought back traditional leveling and experience points, leaving behind 2's situational character development mechanic. But it also added the ability to now let every party member switch between jobs whenever they wished. They were no longer locked into their initial choice for the entire game like in Final Fantasy I. Every job has its own unique type of armor and weapon associated with it, and switching between jobs would cost capacity points, which were awarded after every battle. The longer a character stayed in one job, the better at that job they became, and the higher their stats were, and the lower it cost to switch to that job. This new system added an immense number of new avenues for approaching the game, and raised the ceiling for replayability early on in the franchise. Additionally, 3 is the birthplace of summoning in the series, as well as special battle commands like Steal or the iconic Dragoon attack, Jump. Yet again, Final Fantasy III saw great success in every way that counted. Sadly, this was another game in the series that didn't initially get localized outside of Japan. But this was because the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or Super Famicom, was mere months away from launching, and Square wanted to focus on getting games out the door for it. Funnily enough, this led to the development of not just Final Fantasy IV, but also Final Fantasy V. However, not the 4 and 5 you're thinking of. In preparation of the forthcoming new generation, Square had planned for 2 Final Fantasy titles to be made: 4, which would still have been for the NES, and 5 for the new SNES. Unfortunately, due to financial and scheduling constraints, the original Final Fantasy IV was cancelled despite being about 80% done according to Sakaguchi, which led to Final Fantasy V being retitled to the 4 we know today. To make naming issues worse, because Final Fantasy hadn't seen a North American release since the first game, 4 was renamed to 2 here in the English-speaking side of the globe. This convention would not get straightened out for quite some time. And so, in July 1991, Final Fantasy IV released in Japan, with the North American release following 4 months later. It followed the tale of Dark Knight Cecil Harvey, captain of the elite air force of Baron, called the Red Wings. Joining him on his adventure is his friend, Dragoon Kane Highwind, love interest and white mage Rosa Farrell, Summoner Rydia, Sage Tella, and a few others. Together, they attempt to stop the sorcerer Golbez from stealing the power of, you guessed it, crystals, with the intention of destroying the world. Sounds like retreaded ground at first, but the story received way more detail and depth than any previous title in the franchise. In fact, the script was so massive it had to be cut down to a quarter of its original length just so it could fit into an SNES cartridge. As far as the plot is concerned, Final Fantasy IV set a new, bold standard for how deep storytelling can be in Japanese RPGs. Once again, the game was directed by Sakaguchi, scored by Uematsu, and artistically led by Amano. Takashi Tokita took over as lead designer after the lead of 3, Hiromichi Tanaka, expressed more interest in developing a real-time combat system that didn't require a separate battle screen. Thus, he went over to work on another legendary Square game, Secret of Mana, with other former Final Fantasy team members Koichi Ishii and Nasir Gebeli. Hiroyuki Ito, who worked on Final Fantasy I and II as a debugger and 3 as a sound effects designer, returned to 4 as a battle designer. Work was pretty typical for him until one day he witnessed something on television, a Formula 1 race where he saw drivers pass each other on the track at varying speeds. This gave him the idea of characters performing actions in battle at different speeds as well. This was the birth of the Active Time Battle System, or ATB. This was the first battle system to be named by the team, and to say it was a game changer would be an understatement. Simply put, the ATB system was a revolutionary new way of merging real-time with turn-based. It maintained the menu navigating combat that the series was currently known for, while still having the pace of the battle be dictated by actual passing time. A meter below or next to a character's name fills up. Once it's done, the character is able to commit an action. Then the meter empties again and the process repeats. Even enemies had their own invisible meter too. This system allowed the speed stat to be more important than ever because it directly controlled how quickly a character's meter would fill. Not only that, but the game's configuration menu allowed players to quicken the pace of battles in general so menu junkies could increase those precious actions per minute by never experiencing any downtime. But it still doesn't stop there. The ATB system also granted the choice between active mode or wait mode. In active mode, everyone's meter, including the enemies, fills up constantly, even when the player is busy navigating menus. This essentially made combat real-time. It was no longer truly turn-based because if you spent too long fumbling around in the menu, you were letting your opponent perform multiple actions consecutively. Thus, playing in active mode was dangerous to anyone who wasn't insanely fast at choosing their next move, because they would end up losing their rhythm, which might heavily impact their strategy. Wait mode was the opposite. Everyone's meter paused while a menu was open, maintaining the expected turn order throughout the battle. Again, the ATB was a stroke of genius. It allowed even greater customization over the combat experience beyond the equipment, stats, and actions of the characters themselves. While the ATB still facilitated a true turn-based experience with certain settings, one thing is undeniable. It is still more action-y than a traditional turn-based system like the previous 3 games had. Final Fantasy IV released to immense critical acclaim and commercial success. In Japan, the game sold 200,000 copies on the first day, which was an immense number, especially considering it launched on a console that was barely more than half a year old at that point. The game was lauded for setting a new gold standard for story-heavy RPGs coming out of Japan, and the ATB combat system was praised for encouraging players to learn how to make snap decisions so they aren't overwhelmed. It was so ambitious that people thought it was already maxing out the potential of the new SNES platform. As the years went by, more people began to retrospectively call Final Fantasy IV not only one of the best games in the series, but one of the best games of all time for all the new, incredible narrative achievements and mechanical concepts it brought to the table. To make the creation of this game even more incredible, the entire development team was made up of only 14 people, and production completed in only 1 year. And last but not least, 4 was the first title in the career of a certain debugger and budding artist who would eventually become one of the most famous and controversial figures for the company. As always, development on the next game began soon after the release of the previous one, and Final Fantasy V showed immense promise right off the bat with the involved talent, most of whom were returning names, like Sakaguchi, Amano, Uematsu, Ito, and sprite artist Kazuko Shibuya. But 2 specific names that weren't necessarily new, but still rather unknown at the time, were ones that people would have to keep an eye on: scenario writer Yoshinori Kitase and monster designer Tetsuya Nomura. Kitase started his career as co-writer and co-designer of Final Fantasy Adventure for the Game Boy, a project led by Koichi Ishii. He then worked on Romancing Saga as field map designer before finally finding himself on Final Fantasy V, as co-writer alongside Sakaguchi himself. As stated before, Nomura's only other credit was debugger for Final Fantasy IV, but under the tutelage of artist Tetsuya Takahashi, Nomura further developed his artistic talent and became monster designer for Final Fantasy V. Kitase would later go on to be a producer for the entire mainline Final Fantasy series and eventually join Square Enix's board of directors. Nomura would also go on to lead the Kingdom Hearts franchise and later the Final Fantasy VII Remake saga. As one would expect, Final Fantasy V maintained the popular ATB system from the previous game. But one other system they brought back that wasn't previously in 4 is the job system, which would receive a major overhaul by Ito. Final Fantasy V's job system was hugely expanded in both variety and application from its version seen in 3. In 5, the player can move their party to any of the 22 available jobs, which are developed with their own form of experience points called ability points, which are gained alongside regular XP. As each character becomes better with their job, they're able to switch over to other jobs and take a few abilities of their old job with them, allowing for an incredible new mechanic of multi-classing. Meaning, if a character is initially a knight, but you want them to be more of a spell sword, you can later move them to Black Mage and bring a couple of knight abilities over with the switch. This small but impactful change to the job system opened up even more doors for team build variety and even replayability. To this day, Final Fantasy V's job system remains one of the deeper and more nuanced forms of character development in the whole series. Once again, Final Fantasy V was a smash hit in its native country of Japan, selling an absolutely whopping 900,000 copies in 1 day. Not only that, but members of the developmental staff also had a particular fondness for the game, with Sakaguchi saying it was his favorite among all the ones he worked on, and Amano saying it featured some of the character designs he's most proud of. Much later, both Nomura and Kitase would go on record to state that they would be interested in remaking the game from the ground up, too. All of this sadly adds to the tragedy that is the fact that 5 was not released in North America for a long time. 7 years, in fact. It was another localization casualty caused by office politics, because Square thought that the game was too difficult and inaccessible for Western gamers, on top of having a much more different tone than what they might have been used to with the last 2 games they received. Thankfully, when the game eventually did reach Western audiences, it developed a popular reputation there, especially the Game Boy Advance version of the game, which included a plethora of new features and content. Square continued to keep pace, and development for Final Fantasy VI began soon after 5's release. There were some slight changes to the development team, however, when Sakaguchi was promoted to executive vice president of the company, leaving him without the time to be as hands-on as he usually was. Thus, the director's chair would end up being shared between Ito and Kitase, and Sakaguchi would be producer. More specifically, Kitase was in charge of all story-related aspects of production, while Ito was in charge of combat. While he had many other commitments as the new EVP, Sakaguchi was still present enough to supervise the project to ensure smooth sailing. Other returning staff members included Tetsuya Nomura as graphics director now, Kaori Tanaka, aka Soraya Saga, as field graphic designer, Amano as concept artist, and of course, Uematsu as composer. The story of Final Fantasy VI was written by several people, but led by Kitase and Sakaguchi. It takes place in a world that no longer was strictly about knights, swords, and spells, but also incredible steampunk-inspired technology, meant to go toe-to-toe with magic users. While past games had instances of technology that weren't usually seen in medieval fantasy settings, like airships, 6 was the first game to completely travel outside of that realm and embrace a world in the middle of an industrial revolution. The cast of main characters featured a large team of 14 permanently playable party members, on top of several temporarily playable ones too. The plot dealt with numerous heavy, mature themes, including, but not limited to, rebellion against a militaristic dictatorship, the usage of chemical weapons in war, violent and globally devastating confrontations, and multiple personal redemption stories for different characters. For all it's worth, Final Fantasy VI boasted the most detailed, nuanced, and thematically rich story in the history of the series thus far, all while taking the Final Fantasy name out of your run-of-the-mill medieval fantasy setting where crystals are the centerpiece of the narrative. Gameplay-wise, it was still mostly the same at its core. Unfortunately, the job system of 5 didn't make a return, but customization was still possible by equipping characters with weapons, armor, and new, powerful accessories called relics. These relics had strong, useful effects, like protecting against status effects, automatically buffing the wearer, or increasing their stats by substantial amounts. And there's also a new mechanic in combat called the Desperation Attack, a powerful move that has a chance to appear when a character's health is low. Graphically, Final Fantasy VI had the most detailed sprites in the series thus far, and no longer had to sacrifice that detail when going from the battle screen to the map screen. Like 4 and 5 before it, it also took advantage of the SNES's Mode 7 graphics, which was a trick the console achieved by taking a background asset, rotating it, and scaling it line by line to create the illusion of depth, a faux 3D visual effect. However, 6 used this feature much more often than its two predecessors did. Final Fantasy VI released in Japan on April 2, 1994, with the North American release following 6 months later under the name Final Fantasy III. In its home country, it sold 2.3 million copies within just a few months, and overseas it sold enough to be in the top 10 bestsellers of the year despite releasing in October, which sounds promising, but the actual figure isn't so impressive, as it took 9 years to hit only 860,000 sales here. The vast majority of the game's success was in Japan, where 2.6 million copies were shipped. Regardless, the game would end up being given many year-end awards both domestically and internationally. Right off the bat, Final Fantasy VI was already considered one of the best in the series, if not the best, period. But as the years have passed, this legacy has only gotten stronger, and it sits firmly in the history books as one of the greatest games ever. And as always, Square wanted to keep up the momentum. Development for Final Fantasy VII would begin its early stages in 1994, and was originally planned to be another 2D game for the SNES, but was put on hold to help the Chrono Trigger team finish their own project, a game that would also go down in history in its own right. Once their contributions to that game were finished, the Final Fantasy team resumed discussions for the sequel. Again, Sakaguchi stepped back to keep his producer role and allow others to be more hands-on, including director Kitase, who would be the sole director of 7. Again, they considered keeping the game 2D, which was the safest and quickest way to make it, but the studio leads saw the writing on the wall and noticed the imminent shift towards 3D graphics. The platforms to choose from at the time were the Nintendo 64 and Sony PlayStation, with the Sega Saturn pushed off to the side due to its noticeable lack of hype and consumer interest. After tests showed that the N64 was too technologically incapable of handling their vision, the team decided to go with the PlayStation, Sony's debut console. Its games were printed on CD-ROMs, which held significantly more storage space than the N64's cartridges, and allowed Square to fit the beautiful pre-rendered cutscenes they would become known for onto them. 7 would adopt a presentation of completely 3D character models on pre-rendered backgrounds that offered the team their own choice of camera angles, which gave a very cinematic look. 7's graphics and audio quality were dramatically improved over 6, but the gameplay remained largely the same with the continued utilization of the ATB system. One big change was made to character development, however, in the form of materia, the natural evolution of 6's relics. With materia, party members no longer relied on their own innate skills. Players could now mix and match abilities and increase stats between characters as much as they pleased, creating a very open-ended method of growth for the cast, and allowing players to prepare their loadouts on a battle-by-battle basis. The game's story and setting would be a drastic departure from the mostly medieval fantasy worlds the series had taken place in up to that point. 7 was looking to be set in a much more modern world. In fact, when the game was still a 2D title planned for the SNES, Square considered having it take place in the very real location of New York City. Seriously. However, that setting eventually went to Parasite Eve, and the team brought in veteran Square writer Kazushige Nojima, who was fresh off the heels of his latest game, Bahamut Lagoon, and thus the narrative began building. Unlike Final Fantasy VI, where a large cast of characters were considered equally important, the team wanted to focus on a select few characters and their own deep arcs. So the story of Avalanche, Shinra, Cloud, and Sephiroth ended up being the focal point of the experience, soon leading to the creation of Zack as well. In time, the plot would become the journey we all know and love, a mercenary who joins an eco-terrorist organization to stop a world-controlling megacorporation from using the planet's life essence as an energy source. Final Fantasy VII launched in Japan in January 1997, and North America in September that same year. Right out of the gate, it received universal acclaim, lauded for its art direction, the FMV cutscenes, battle gameplay, the depth of the world and characters, the gorgeous music once again scored by Uematsu, and overall emotional impact of the whole package. Even when the game was brand new, it was regarded as an instant classic that many would remember and look fondly on for years on end. This sentiment not only stayed the same, but grew further. The game's legacy is, without question, the farthest reaching out of any mainline Final Fantasy title, leading to an entire sub-franchise dedicated specifically to its world and characters, dubbed the Compilation of Final Fantasy VII, featuring various sequels, prequels, and supplementary material. The main cast are instantly recognizable icons, and the city of Midgar is one of the most famous fictional locations in gaming history. A famous tech demo made for the PlayStation 3 debuted in 2005 to showcase the console's power, leading to dramatically increased demand for a remake of the original game. And in 2020, that remake was finally released. But it wasn't necessarily the retelling people expected. But that's a story for another video. At the time of its release, 7 was the most expensive video game ever made, with a budget between $40 to $45 million. Adjusted for inflation, that would be between $75 to $84 million today. As of January of this year, Final Fantasy VII has sold 14.1 million copies across all versions, and like other games before it in the same series, it would go down as one of the best of all time. In 1997, after the release of 7 and the production of its English translation, work began on Final Fantasy VIII. At this point, Sakaguchi's role in development had been further reduced from producer to executive producer, because he had commitments to fulfill as the director for the upcoming film, Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within. Thus, the director's chair for the game was left to Kitase once again. The producer position would then go to Shinji Hashimoto, which would be his first time working on a Final Fantasy game. Returning staff included battle designer Ito, character designer Nomura, art director Yusuke Naura, lead writer Nojima, composer Uematsu, and lead programmer Kent Narita. The game's visual design maintained pre-rendered backgrounds, but also more realistically proportioned character models on the field map, a dramatic improvement over the less detailed, super deformed, or chibi models the cast had in 7's field maps. The story was conceived by Kitase and written by Nojima, and it follows a group of young mercenaries led by a young man named Squall, as they are drawn into a conflict sparked by the sorceress named Idea Kramer, who seized control of a powerful military state. During the quest to defeat the sorceress and greater forces manipulating her, Squall struggles with his role as a leader and develops a romance with one of his comrades, Rinoa. 8 was the first mainline game to have its narrative center around a romantic relationship, a point that was met with equal parts criticism and enthusiasm depending on who you asked. And once again, this story took place in a markedly modern or even futuristic world. Gameplay remained mostly the same when it came down to how actual battles functioned, as the ATB system made yet another return. But the biggest difference was the character development. Materia was gone and replaced with the Junction system, an odd but admittedly unique system that involved equipping a Guardian Force, the game's summons, to a character, which would then allow the player to equip spells, which had usage amounts now because MP was gone, to stats to increase them. The stronger the spell, the more it would increase a stat, but it also meant a trade-off. If you used the spell while it was equipped, then the stat would go down. It was a fascinating concept that might have left some people divided on its actual execution, but it was no doubt an original idea. A popular way of acquiring spells was by sacrificing cards you collect for the immensely popular Triple Triad card game, an addictive little distraction that would steal many people's time away for hours. Another big difference separating 8 from past games, and probably the most divisive aspect of its gameplay, was scaling enemy levels. Enemies became stronger as your characters grew in levels, and this was often a bad thing, because many enemies grew in strength by greater proportion to their levels than the player's team probably did, meaning the Junction system was the only way to gain real power, because levels were practically worthless. The end goal in 8's development mechanics was to stay as low a level as possible while gathering strong spells to equip. It was a strange and massive departure from how past games did things, and unsurprising that a decent amount of players disliked it. However, when the game released in February 1999 in Japan and September 1999 in North America, the huge deviation in certain gameplay elements did not stop reviews from being highly positive. Like past games, it received high scores and plenty of end-of-year awards. But one thing that was stacked against it was expectations. After the 1-2 punch of 6 and 7, 8 was in a rare position where being a great game still would not be enough. It had to be exceptional to maintain the momentum of its predecessors. And while it scored high numbers from reviewers, some of them still remarked how it was a disappointment because it simply wasn't the near-perfect experience they had come to expect from Final Fantasy. Either way, it would still go on to be a success, and as of 2019, it has sold 9.6 million copies across all versions. Yet again, eyes were still staring at the future, and the early planning stage for Final Fantasy IX began just before 8 even released. The team was aware that this would be the final title for the PlayStation 1, so Sakaguchi decided to become more closely involved than the previous 2 games. So he took it upon himself to be the lead writer on top of co-producing with Hashimoto. At the time, Sakaguchi said that 9 was his personal favorite out of all the games he worked on, because he felt it was the closest to what his ideal Final Fantasy would be. The team also wanted a stronger sense of character development for the main cast, and the active time events concept was created, a system that would feature an individual character's exploration away from the protagonist. Funnily enough, despite the passion being put into the project, it was originally not going to be a mainline numbered Final Fantasy. It was initially conceptualized as a Gaiden, or side story to the series, but obviously that ended up changing as production progressed. The story of 9 primarily focuses on a war between 2 nations, and follows protagonist Zidane, who kidnaps Princess Garnet as a means of stopping her mother, Queen Brane, from escalating the war further. The journey brings Final Fantasy back to a primarily medieval setting, but with an interesting twist. Steam technology is starting to become widespread. Amusingly, the decision to bring the series back to a more medieval world sparked some worries within the development team that the audience wouldn't like it, after having gotten used to more modern or futuristic settings with 7 and 8. Gameplay for 9 remained mostly the same, once again bringing the ATB system back for combat. But character development saw another major transformation after 8. This time it was simplified back to a more traditional system with a special ability mechanic that's vaguely similar to Materia, called Magic Stones. Characters gain Magic Stones as they level up, and thus can use those stones to equip more abilities at once. Characters have overlap for many of these abilities, but a few are exclusive to specific individuals. Final Fantasy IX was released in Japan on July 7, 2000, after being delayed in order to avoid stepping on the toes of Dragon Quest VII, a premier game of Enix's flagship franchise. Before their merger, Square and Enix were seen as rivals, but Dragon Quest had greater power in their home country, so moving Final Fantasy IX out of the way was a smart move on Square's part. It was later released in North America in November that same year. Unsurprisingly, as guaranteed as death and taxes, 9 saw major success both critically and commercially. Critics loved it, especially its story and simplified combat, and according to Square's own numbers, the original PlayStation version by itself sold over 5.5 million copies. Sakaguchi had another hit on his hands, and his passion for the franchise had not died down just because he was placed in higher positions that took time away from personal contributions. 9 was seen as the ultimate love letter to the series as a whole, incorporating its most popular themes, ideas, and concepts. Like many of its predecessors, 9 would go down as one of the best games of all time, and a swan song title for the original PlayStation. In 1999, before Final Fantasy IX even released, development on 10 had already begun, with a set budget of 4 billion yen, which translates to $58.3 million US today. The development team was made up of over 100 people, with some notable reshufflings of positions. Kitase was now the chief director and producer of the game, while Sakaguchi was back to being executive producer, watching over the project from a distance. Other directors participated in production, overseeing specific aspects of the game. Motomu Toriyama was the event director, Takayoshi Nakazato was the map director, and Toshiro Tsuchida was the battle director. Writing for the game had many credits, specifically Kitase, Nojima, Toriyama, and Daisuke Watanabe, with some contributions from Nomura, who was also character designer. 10 was also the first game in the mainline series to have composers other than Uematsu. In addition to the famed master himself, the game's score was also made with the efforts of Masashi Hamauzu and Junya Nakano. Taking place in the world of Spira, which was ravaged by many catastrophic events, the game's story revolves around a group of adventurers and their quest to defeat a gargantuan, rampaging monster known as Sin. The main protagonist is a blitzball athlete named Tidus, who finds himself transported to Spira after Sin destroyed his home city of Zanarkand. Shortly after arriving to this new world, Tidus becomes a guardian, with several others, to a summoner named Yuna, who initiates a long pilgrimage to destroy Sin. The game's narrative saw major changes in the form of fully 3D environments, a drastic change from the pre-rendered backgrounds the series had been using for 3 games prior. There was also the massive inclusion of voice acting for the very first time, a feature that was actually somewhat controversial. And, like Final Fantasy VIII, it's one of the few mainline titles to have a romantic relationship at the center of its story. But artistic and narrative direction weren't the only thing to see big changes. Final Fantasy X was the first game to finally put aside the ATB system for a new turn-based system that was more reminiscent of traditional gameplay, but with a few modern tweaks. Designed by Tsuchida, the Conditional Turn-Based Battle, or CTB, system did not operate in rounds like the earliest Final Fantasy games did. Instead, there is an act list, which displays the order of turns where party members and enemies were mixed up depending mostly on their speed stat, meaning faster participants could take more turns than slower ones, so speed was actually a very important attribute for characters to have. Not only that, but spells and abilities also applied a cooldown that would also affect their speed. The more powerful the ability or spell, the more the cooldown would push the character down the act list. While getting rid of the popular and recognizable ATB system was controversial, the CTB system it was replaced by ended up being an extremely investing form of combat that only drew out the player's potential for decision-making and strategy. Those who really understood how to control the act list would dominate the battle. Incredible new systems did not stop there though. 10 also introduced what is possibly the most popular character development system in the series, second only to Materia, the Sphere Grid. Enemies don't have specific levels assigned to them, and their strength is determined solely by set statistics, and defeating them did not give experience points, but AP instead, and when characters got enough AP, they gained a sphere level, which meant one more node could be unlocked on their own massive chart full of them, called the Sphere Grid. What made the Sphere Grid particularly fascinating was how much freedom it offered once you understood how it worked and where certain nodes were, because every party member's grid offered a more or less standard path to follow, but if you knew when and where to break that path and deviate, then you could completely turn that character into a different archetype. Auron, who is often treated as the hard-hitting muscle, could be turned into a mage, and Yuna, the healer, could be turned into a melee-focused freight train, or anything in between. What's even crazier is that challenge runs that involve not using the Sphere Grid at all are also possible. So possible that people have even defeated extra difficult optional bosses in no Sphere Grid runs before. Basically, this system offered a new kind of open-endedness that was never brought to the series until now. Final Fantasy X released in Japan on July 19, 2001, and North America on December 17 that same year. It received critical acclaim from domestic and foreign publications, collecting many perfect or near-perfect scores, with much of the praise heaped onto the story, Sphere Grid, CTB system, music, and voice acting. However, in cases where it was criticized, it was usually directed at the game's linearity, because its world design was undeniably the most simplistic the series had seen up until that point. In regard to sales, Square had initially anticipated more modest figures due to the young age of the PlayStation 2, expecting only about 2 million copies sold worldwide. However, within its first day of release in Japan, it had already shipped 2.14 million copies, including about 1.5 million pre-orders. 10 became the first PS2 game to reach the 2 and 4 million copies sold milestones. As of 2017, the PS2 version of the game has sold over 8 million copies worldwide. In December 1999, development began for Final Fantasy XI, not long after Sakaguchi proposed the idea of making an MMORPG. The undertaking would not be a small one, and would call for the merger of 4 internal teams to work together. The crews for Parasite Eve 2, Brave Fencer Musashi, the Mana series, and Chrono Cross. Hiromichi Tanaka, producer and lead designer of 11, stated that many ambitious ideas that were too advanced for the technology available for Final Fantasies 1 through 3 were finally realized in 11, making the MMO not only a new online experience, but a love letter to early titles. Other key team members for development were director Koichi Ishii, programmer Ken Narita, art director Ryosuke Aiba, and plot supervisor Masato Kato. The game's music was composed through a joint effort by Naoshi Mizuta, Kumi Tanioka, and of course Nobuo Uematsu. However, Tanioka would eventually pursue other projects, and Uematsu would leave Square entirely, leaving Mizuta to score all subsequent expansion packs on his own. Taking place in the world of Vana'diel, players are able to select from a wide variety of jobs to play as, including familiar basic jobs like warrior, monk, thief, black mage, and white mage, and advanced jobs unlocked later, such as bard, Dark Knight, Summoner, Ninja, and Blue Mage. There are several different in-universe races for players to represent themselves with, including the Elvan, Galka, Hume, Mithra, and Taru. Original plans were to release the game simultaneously on PlayStation 2 and PC, for both Japan and North America, but unfortunately these plans were dramatically altered. The game first released in May 2002 for Japan on PS2, then November 2002 for PC. North America didn't receive the game until October 2003 for PC and March 2004 for PS2. This was a rather frustrating release schedule for North America because it left the English-speaking players dramatically behind their Japanese peers in terms of progress. But the gap would slowly close in the subsequent months. Some American players would lose patience for the official release and simply play the Japanese version of the game on Japanese servers anyway. Final Fantasy XI's combat system is referred to simply as Real-Time Battle, or RTB. It's more or less the same kind of combat that was prominent in MMOs during the time, with enemies roaming the map and no separate battle screen. Meaning, 11 was technically the first mainline Final Fantasy to get rid of random battles. 11 was also one of the earliest cross-platform games, allowing PS2 and PC players to play together, later adding PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 players as well. Sadly, the game was never brought to the Wii, and the main reason was apparently because of the console's use of friend codes instead of regular usernames. In 2006, the game reached 200 to 300,000 player logins per day, with approximately 150,000 playing at any given time. And in 2009, the game reached 2 million active characters for the first time. Being an MMO with a subscription-based model, this meant 11 was the most profitable game in the series. Over the years, it's received numerous expansions and content updates, and still does today, even with the popularity of its successor, Final Fantasy XIV. 11 still has several populated servers that are bustling with enough activity that new players deciding to hop in for the first time in 2023 will still find others to play with quite easily. As of making this video, a new scenario questline is currently available and still being added to. In late 2001, the remarkable success of Final Fantasy X was obvious, and wanting to strike while the iron was hot, Square did the unthinkable. The first ever direct sequel to a Final Fantasy game. X-2 began development at this time, and the creation of it was met with mixed responses even within Square itself. For example, lead writer Nojima disliked the idea of continuing X's story, especially ending it on a happy note. But the production of the game came with a few conveniences that eased the process. Even though the development team for X-2 was only a third of the size of the team that made its predecessor, everyone was already familiar with the material and had many assets ready to be reused. This allowed the game to complete a full development cycle in only 1 year. Story-wise, the world of Spira was in a much better and happier place following the events of X, so having an upbeat atmosphere was important according to producer Kitase and director Toriyama. This optimistic outlook is what led to the team seeking inspiration from things like magical girl anime and J-pop music. The actual narrative involves Yuna, Riku, and new character Pain in their journey to stop political conflicts from escalating into war. Additionally, Yuna seeks to find a way to bring Tidus back to Spira. X-2 was the first game in the series to have only 3 playable characters and an all-female team. Gameplay-wise, a few key changes were made. First, combat brought back the ATB, but this time in a faster and more involving implementation. Now, characters no longer moved strictly one at a time. It was possible for their attacks to overlap, and it's possible to chain consecutive attacks for greater damage. For character development, the sphere grid was also removed and replaced by dress spheres, which is basically a new type of job system. Dress spheres determine the character's weapon, base stats, and appearance, and are used in battle by placing them on a character's garment grid. Said character can then switch between dress spheres at any point in battle, opening the door for new team-based strategy on a battle-by-battle basis. Overall, the gameplay required more snap decision-making than its predecessor, and would serve as a foundation for a future Final Fantasy title. 10-2 released in Japan on March 13, 2003, and North America in November that same year. Reception was generally positive, and sales were unsurprisingly high, but it still drew criticism for the stark difference in tone from 10, and that the non-linear mission-based structure made the game feel unfocused to some. Regardless, it went on to be an overall success, and created the opportunity for other Final Fantasies to perhaps receive their own direct sequels too. Of course, 10-2 being developed didn't stop the mainline series from chugging along like the unstoppable freight train it's been. Simultaneously, another team had begun working on a more ambitious project, Final Fantasy XII. Development actually began just before 10 launched, with it being led by 9's director Ito and the iconic Yasumi Matsuno. This was Matsuno's first ever time working on a mainline Final Fantasy title, but he had already made a name for himself by being the director and writer of other fantastic and beloved games, such as Tactics Ogre, Final Fantasy Tactics, and Vagrant Story. Sadly, Matsuno's position as co-director was compromised due to health concerns, and he would be replaced by Hiroshi Minagawa, another senior member of Matsuno's usual team. In fact, the team behind 12 was almost entirely the Vagrant Story team, save for Ito himself and 10's writer Watanabe. 12 also marked the first time where Nobuo Uematsu was almost completely absent from composing the score, contributing only one song which would end up being used for the end credits. The heavy lifting in that department was done mostly by Hitoshi Sakamoto, with some contributions from Hayato Matsuo and Masaharu Iwata. The art direction was led by Akihiko Yoshida, Hideo Minaba, and Isamu Kamikokuryo, and the lead writers were Watanabe, Miwa Shoda, and Matsuno. The game takes place in Evilis, a fictional world where many of Matsuno's games are set, including Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story, where the empires of Arcadia and Rosaria are waging an endless war. Dalmasca, a smaller kingdom, is caught between the warring nations, and when Dalmasca is annexed by Arcadia, its princess, Ashe, creates a resistance movement. During the struggle, she meets Vaughn, a young adventurer who dreams of becoming a sky pirate in command of an airship. They are soon joined by a band of allies, and together they rally against the tyranny of the Arcadian Empire. The game has a very distinct Mediterranean influence in its art direction. In fact, the art team took a trip to Turkey during development for inspiration. This created an overall aesthetic and atmosphere that truly set Evilis apart from the settings of previous Final Fantasy games. It helped set the foundation for how many changes 12 was making, not only in its world design, but in its gameplay. Firstly, there's the simple fact that 12 was quite possibly the most open Final Fantasy ever at that point, allowing for a remarkable amount of freedom and exploration for the player in its segmented open world. Even though the map was split into smaller regions, the game did an excellent job at making the whole world feel like one massive, cohesive setting. And then there's battles. Once again, a major overhaul had occurred with the battle system, now called Active Dimension Battle, or ADB, and it was probably the biggest change to date. 12 is the first single-player Final Fantasy to get rid of random encounters, following 11's example of just having enemies roam around the map openly, and allowing players to engage or avoid them at their own discretion. It was also the first single-player Final Fantasy to have a fully controllable camera. The third and biggest combat change was the Gambit system, an in-depth series of orders and dependencies you can program your AI-controlled party members to follow so you don't have to manually control them. This new system allowed for huge customization of AI actions, and players could achieve a sense of efficiency and speed barely seen before in past games. This is especially true when the International Zodiac Job System version of the game released with a turbo mode that allowed players to dramatically increase battle speed at the push of a button. This made 12's combat the fastest the series had ever seen until that point. As for character development systems, 12 had the license board. The system consists of different tiled boards for each job with hundreds of squares. each square representing an ability, spell, equipment piece, or augment. By defeating enemies in battle, characters earn license points. Characters must then spend their LP to activate squares on the license board, granting them access to new abilities and allowing them to equip stronger weapons and armor. Basically, the license board was a smaller but less linear version of the sphere grid, and did not require multiple types of currency like the grid did. Final Fantasy XII released in Japan on March 16, 2006, with the North American release trailing in October that same year. Unsurprisingly, it was showered with praise. It received the rare perfect 40 out of 40 score from Famitsu, which was also given to Vagrant Story, making it the second Matsuno-led game to achieve it. The game received similar high praise from English-speaking publications and websites too, with critics lauding the graphics, art direction, story, gambit system, and license board, and would go on to take home numerous awards at the end of the year. It sold over 1.7 million copies in Japan on the first week, and approximately 1.5 million in its first week in North America. As of 2009, over 6 million copies of the PS2 version were sold. In February 2004, after the release of Final Fantasy X-2's expanded version, dubbed International Plus Last Mission, the team finally went on to begin development of Final Fantasy XIII, with Motomu Toriyama set as director and Kitase as producer. Toriyama employed the assistance of Nojima to conceive the mythology of crystals that would set the foundation for the Fabula Nova Crystallis series of games with their own tied-in universe. In 2006, when the narrative started to take shape, Toriyama brought Watanabe onto the writing team. Toriyama would give him an outline of the first 8 chapters of the game, with several key scenes that needed to be implemented, and Watanabe would go on to craft the script around these details. At first, the game was intended to be the last mainline Final Fantasy title for the PlayStation 2, but after the positive reception to the legendary and infamous Final Fantasy VII tech demo for the PlayStation 3, the team decided to shift over to the new, upcoming generation using their new in-house game engine, called Crystal Tools. Other noteworthy staff members were Tetsuya Nomura as the main character designer, and Toshiro Tsuchida as the battle system director. Masashi Hamauzu would go on to be the sole composer for the game's score, making 13 the first mainline game to not feature any compositions from Nobuo Uematsu at all. The game takes place in the fictional floating world of Cocoon, whose government, the Sanctum, is ordering a purge of civilians who have supposedly come into contact with Pulse, the much-feared world below. The former soldier Lightning begins her fight against the government in order to save her sister, who has been branded as an unwilling servant to a godlike being from Pulse, making her an enemy of Cocoon. Lightning and a band of allies, who also become marked by the same Pulse creature, rally against the Sanctum while trying to avoid being turned into monsters or crystals as a result of their own brandings. Unlike previous games, the world of Cocoon was directly inspired by the United States, based on numerous locations the art team visited. Art director Isamu Kamikokuryo stated that the number of environments the art team made that ended up being cut could have been enough to make another entire game. Toriyama stated that these cuts were made at multiple points in development, including near the very end. Reason being, the team felt they couldn't make these locations as graphically appealing as the story-crucial areas. Gameplay-wise, there are some noteworthy changes. The combat used the new Command Synergy Battle System, or CSB, and it felt like an evolution of what 10.2 offered. It brought back the ATB bar, but used it in a very different way. It was more like an action point meter divided into sections. Each action consumes a portion of the ATB gauge. Commands can be chained so long as there are enough ATB segments. Furthermore, the game had its own type of job system, called paradigms. There are a total of 6 jobs, or roles, and the paradigm itself is the specific combination of roles the team is using at that moment, which can be switched mid-battle. These roles are also related to the game's character development system, the Crystarium, where players level up the character's jobs, not the character themselves. In execution, it's essentially a much smaller and more simplified version of the sphere grid. Final Fantasy XIII was released in Japan on December 17, 2009, with a worldwide launch in the following March of 2010. It sold over 1 million copies on the first day in its home country, while it took about a month to reach that figure in North America, but overall hit numbers that would ultimately satisfy Square Enix. Reviews and player reactions, however, were not so clear-cut. Praise was given for its new battle system, graphics, and overall presentation, but critics were more divided on the game's map design. I mentioned earlier that many environments and settings were removed because they weren't visually appealing, and this included areas like towns. This led to the biggest shortcoming of the game that many people criticized: linearity. The vast majority of the content that would make it into the final product was very straightforward, to the point where exploration was minimal, if not non-existent. After the incredibly large and open feeling of 12, this was seen as a dramatic step down. This marked the first time that reviews were disappointing enough that Square would actually directly respond to them. Toriyama initially rebutted the criticism, stating it came from people who approached the game from a Western point of view, and that it was difficult to tell a compelling story when you offer that much freedom. Again, this was a strange comment to make, considering the vastness of 12 and how well received it ended up being, plus how open the series had been in general up until now. Later, he and Kitase would be more accepting of the complaints, acknowledging that they came from a feeling that there was a lack of interaction between the player and the world, and that the linearity made a huge portion of the game feel like an extended tutorial. Generally speaking, however, the game is still considered well received overall, and by 2017, the console versions have sold over 7 million copies in total. In 2005, planning for Final Fantasy XIV had already begun, a whopping 4 years before it would even be officially announced. The main staff behind the development team was made up of franchise veterans, including Hiromichi Tanaka, the producer of 11, Nobuaki Komoto, a director of 11, Yaiko Sato, who was a writer for 11 and 12, and Akihiko Yoshida, who was an art director for 12 and Vagrant Story. But they wouldn't be the only ones to lead the project. Square decided to bring in one more director who had actually been working on Dragon Quest arcade games up until now, Naoki Yoshida, aka Yoshi P. He had actually joined Square Enix to work on Dragon Quest X, which was another MMO, as chief designer, but his work ended up being extended to the Monster Battle Road spin-offs, and he left the Dragon Quest X team once the core gameplay was completed. The company's internal policies at the time forbade multiple directors working on the same project at the same time, and since Jin Fujisawa was made full-time director, Yoshi P's superiors removed him from the project, and while he was on a business trip at that. As development for 14 continued, the team was plagued by non-stop problems. Even though the leads were familiar with MMO design now thanks to their experience with 11, the rest of the team wasn't. And the complications brought on by the Crystal Tools engine didn't help either, as it wasn't designed for MMOs in mind, and was ultimately unsuited for the game's needs. This didn't stop the team from trying, however, but they were still handicapped by one big issue: an unhealthy obsession with graphical fidelity over gameplay content, which led to important parts of the game experience being neglected. Even then, the graphical fidelity still caused a significant number of sacrifices, like meager number of player characters on screen, and environmental assets needing to be constantly reused to keep loading times reasonable. The team was burdened by 6th generation development mindsets instead of trying to adapt for the 7th generation, featuring the PlayStation 3. On top of all that, the team also foolishly believed that all of these problems could simply be fixed in post-launch patches. The game finally went live on September 30th, 2010, and while sales were initially strong, the success did not last long, as players quickly found out how completely and utterly broken it was. The game could barely run, the user interface was a mess, and the gameplay and story pace were unbearable. The game had pretty graphics and some neat ideas, but that couldn't save it from being a disaster. It finally happened. Square released the first ever, undeniably bad Final Fantasy game. Not disappointing or divisive, but bad. Not bad for Final Fantasy, but bad in general. It was not a mediocre Final Fantasy experience, it was an overall shitty video game. This onslaught of viciously negative reception shook Square Enix to its core. 14 being a failure was probably the biggest catastrophe that could have happened to them, because they had hoped it would be a consistent moneymaker as a subscription-based MMO. It was all hands on deck, and the company scrambled like hell to try and remedy the situation. The free trial was extended twice so players could see post-launch updates before quitting the game entirely. But when that didn't seem to work, the whole development team was restructured. Tanaka and Komoto were removed from their posts as producer and director, with Tanaka publicly taking responsibility for the poor shape of the game. The PS3 version was indefinitely delayed, and Yoshi P took over as both director and producer. Numerous updates were rushed out to try and fix the overall player experience, but no matter what the team did, it could not fix the core issue with the game. The fact that the engine itself and the game's server structure were both critically flawed. This meant that if 14 was to be saved, it needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. The team quickly rewrote the story to build in a lead-up to the next version of the game, and servers were shut down in November 2012, just over 2 years after the game had launched. However, the very next month, alpha testing had begun for the new overhaul, dubbed A Realm Reborn. Yoshi P would publish a roadmap going over the game's pipeline from the beta to launch, and he stated that the team was adamant that the game would not release until they truly felt it was ready. Yoshi P wanted the new game to appeal to both hardcore MMO players and Final Fantasy fans who never touched the genre before, and also wanted to optimize gameplay for controllers. He would go on to make hundreds of design decisions that focused on immediate implementation for an improved user experience, as opposed to decisions that would end up sitting and waiting for approvals from higher-ups. Yoshi P was highly respected for his transparency with players, going so far as to admit that redeeming the franchise's reputation was more important than sales. A Realm Reborn would launch on August 27, 2013 for the PC and PlayStation 3, and thankfully its reception was much more positive this time around. Yoshi P and his team had successfully turned the game around from a barely functional piece of junk to an actual, solid MMO experience. It wasn't a perfect or even standout game among other MMOs, but it was functional, had better implementation of MMO mechanics, features, and systems, and had a strong focus on narrative, much stronger than its genre peers. For all intents and purposes, Yoshi P did succeed in making an MMO that would attract hardcore players of the genre and more casual enjoyers of the Final Fantasy series. And this accomplishment would only become stronger and more pronounced as more content would be added. As the years passed, the game received huge expansions that added to content and narrative, with the team never forgetting that the strongest aspect of any Final Fantasy game was its story. With every expansion that released, the game only got better, and when Shadowbringers launched in 2019, it would go down as an MMO expansion that was better than most standalone mainline games in the franchise. It was a marvel of storytelling, art, music, and significant content. Endwalker would do the same in late 2021, elevating 14's status even further. As of now, 14 has approximately 30 million registered players and about 2 to 2.5 million active subscriptions. It's hard to tell because the team doesn't release hard numbers on a regular basis, so these are strictly estimations on my part. A Realm Reborn and its subsequent expansions have unquestionably gone down in history as not only the best story of redeeming a bad game, but also one of the best MMOs ever. Development began in 2006 for a spin-off game titled Final Fantasy Vs 13, set to be developed by Tetsuya Nomura and his Kingdom Hearts team as part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis subseries. He was adamant on making it a very dark and mature story that normally isn't given its own number title. hence being a spin-off of 13 instead. It was going to be made with the Crystal Tools engine and was announced as a PlayStation 3 exclusive. With Nomura's recent success with Kingdom Hearts 2, the idea of him being given his own big-budget Final Fantasy was actually quite appealing to many people at the time. Unfortunately, things became very complicated. It turns out that Versus 13 was basically still in the conceptual phase when it was announced, meaning nothing really existed of it beyond the announcement trailer and some ideas. Thus, it was still years away. In 2007, the project's increasing scale prompted questions on whether it should be rebranded to its own numbered title. But from then on, the development team had to be split between working on Versus 13 and helping with the development of 13. Once 13 released, however, it didn't get any simpler, because in 2011, the upcoming generation of consoles, the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, were revealed to Square Enix, and they decided to scrap the PS3 version and Crystal Tools engine for next-gen versions on the new Luminous engine instead. With all of these distractions and changes, progress was painfully slow, and in 2012, Square management had to intervene in a big way. Eventually, Nomura was taken off the project and sent to focus more on Kingdom Hearts, and Hajime Tabata was brought in to complete the game. Tabata himself stated that when he inherited the project, the old team only had about 20 to 25% of the game finished. Versus 13 was officially renamed to Final Fantasy XV, and development was running along much more smoothly, with Tabata's team trying to reincorporate ideas and assets made by Nomura's team whenever it was feasible. But for all intents and purposes, Versus 13 and 15 were entirely different entities. Other key staff members of 15's development are producer Shinji Hashimoto, art directors Yusuke Naura and Kamiko Kuryo, character designer Roberto Ferrari, writers Saori Itamoto, Akiko Ishibashi, and Takumi Nishida, and composer Yoko Shimomura. Nomura would still be credited for the original concept and as a main character designer, but any other ties he had to the project while it was known as Versus 13 had been severed. Final Fantasy XV takes place in the fictional world of Eos. Aside from Insomnia, the capital of Lucis, all the world is dominated by the Empire of Niflheim, who seek control of the magical crystal protected by the Lucian royal family. On the eve of peace negotiations, Niflheim attacks the capital and steals the crystal. Noctis Lucius Caelum, heir to the Lucian throne, goes on a quest to rescue the crystal and defeat Niflheim, and he later learns of his full role as the true king, destined to use the crystal's powers to save Eos from eternal darkness. Eos is an extremely modern and slightly futuristic fantasy setting, not unlike what has been done before. One of its most prominent design traits was its large open world where the first half of the game takes place, the continent of Lucis, and it was a true open world at that, not a segmented one, and the party would use a car to get around the huge map. In regard to combat, 15 was the first title to truly lean completely into real-time action. There were no meters or cooldowns to dictate the pace of the fight. It was now as open as it could possibly be, playing vaguely similarly to the mainline Kingdom Hearts games. But Noctis has a couple of his own tricks, such as quick swapping weapons and teleporting across the battlefield. The character development system was pretty straightforward. The main characters leveled up normally, and certain actions in combat will yield ability points. Those ability points would be spent on the Ascension Grid, which is basically a skill tree that either boosts your stats and defenses or unlocks new abilities and actions. The game's magic system was very different from its predecessors in that magic spells were created using elemental energy found around the world and then equipping them like weapons. The player could give spells additional effects by adding items to the creation process. Final Fantasy XV launched simultaneously in Japan and the rest of the world, the first single-player mainline game to do so on November 29, 2016. Reception was generally positive, but not without its fair share of criticisms. The main cast of Noctis and his friends were widely loved, but the story itself was seen as a massive disappointment. The game's graphics, art direction, and environmental design were also praised, but the open world of Lucis was seen as fairly empty by some, while the second half of the game was seen as too linear. The combat was also pretty divisive, with some people enjoying its flashiness but disliking the overall controls. That all being said, 15 would still see some love thrown its way from other Japanese developers who said they enjoyed the game, including Shuhei Yoshida of Sony Interactive, Takashi Morinaka of Koei Tecmo, Shigeo Komori of Atlus, and the father of Final Fantasy himself, Hironobu Sakaguchi. As of May 2022, Final Fantasy XV sold over 10 million copies across all versions, making it one of the best-selling Final Fantasies of all time. As an extra bit of trivia, in 2019, the Japanese Broadcasting Corporation, known as NHK, conducted a nationwide Final Fantasy poll with nearly 500,000 voters. Final Fantasy XV was voted the 10th best game in the series, with over 71% of its votes coming from female participants, a higher proportion than any other game in the series. In the 2005 Electronic Entertainment Expo, or E3, Square decided to show off its shiny new Crystal Tools engine in the most grandiose way they could muster, a recreation of the opening scene of Final Fantasy VII, running on the PlayStation 3. This showcase created a spiral of demand for a true, fully fledged remake of the classic game, and this came sometime after Square Enix promised remakes of 7, 8, and 9 for the PlayStation 2, but had to cancel them once they realized these projects would result in cut content. In spite of the overpowering demand, though, Square continued to deny that any remake was actually being made, and that the tech demo was simply that, a tech demo. They would reiterate numerous times that a remake would take a ton of resources and likely require cutting content to keep the scope of the project manageable. But one day, producer Shinji Hashimoto approached Yoshinori Kitase, Kazushige Nojima, and Tetsuya Nomura and sincerely asked about the idea. The three men, who all worked on the original game as director, writer, and character designer respectively, agreed that they were starting to reach the age where, if they didn't tackle a remake now, they likely never would, and retire, leaving it up to what-ifs, or passing it along to the new generation of Square developers who did not work on the original. And this did not sit right with them, so they decided to finally begin working on the one game that would shake the foundation of the franchise. Nomura would be in the director's position, shared with Toriyama and Naoki Hamaguchi, while Nojima would be the lead writer and Kitase the producer. After years of rumors and requests, Final Fantasy VII Remake was unveiled to the world at E3 2015, and, to the surprise of no one, the response was earth-rending. Not only did the trailer gain 10 million views in 2 weeks, the announcement caused Square's stock prices to shoot up to the highest they had been since 2008. It was official. The video game remake everyone wanted was in full swing, and little did people know at the time it wasn't just one game. It was going to be a multi-part saga. Instead of using Luminous Engine or creating another engine entirely, Square opted to license Unreal Engine 4 and worked with Epic Games Japan to optimize the engine for the game. The team also received technical assistance from the Kingdom Hearts 3 team, as they had been making their game on Unreal as well. Square originally enlisted the help of CyberConnect 2 for the action gameplay design, but in 2017 they decided to make the project completely internal so they could have more control over the quality of the product. But next came the hard part. How big was this remake going to be? They had two options. Make one game but cut out any sections that might be unnecessary, or make multiple games and not cut anything. At first, they closely examined what parts of the story could be removed so that a single game remake could be possible, but determined that no single section could be removed without angering fans. Thus, the multi-part remake idea was chosen, and that the first part would encompass the opening Midgar portion of the narrative. For the most part, Remake was very faithful to the original, but with some key changes. Narratively, the story was kept about 95% the same with added context, world building, and character interactions. The biggest change, however, was gameplay. The original game used the ATB combat system, but Remake would go on to be a real-time action game. Of course, being a remake of a classic, it would still feel wrong to completely exclude the ATB meter, and it was worked in to allow party members to perform abilities, magic, and use items in battle. Each character has 2 ATB segments, and committing any of those aforementioned actions would consume 1. They had to attack or at least allow time to pass in order to fill the segments again. This system made both regular attacks and the ATB meter equally crucial to combat, because the former was needed to fill the latter, and the latter was often needed to perform the most important actions, like high damage attacks and healing magic. In regard to the character development system though, materia was brought back, and worked essentially the same as it did in the original game. Equipping materia to a character gave them whatever skill, spell, or stat boost the materia offered, and in some cases, materia could be linked together for attack or defense buffs. The gameplay experience of Remake was a fascinating combination of massive differences and clear similarities, but it worked, and it worked well. Final Fantasy VII Remake released worldwide on April 10, 2020, to significant hype and fanfare. It received very positive reception overall, especially for the scope of its reimaginings. Plus, the combat, which was seen as a major step up from 15, the excellent characterization of its main cast, the world building, dialogue, incredible amount of new detail in Midgar, and the music, which was now composed by Masashi Hamauzu and Mitsuto Suzuki, based on Uematsu's arrangements for the original game, although Uematsu did contribute one new track, the game's theme song, Hollow. Remake sold 3.5 million copies in the first 3 days, surpassing the launch sales of other huge PlayStation 4 exclusives like Spider-Man and God of War. It was a massive success, and as of right now, fans of the 7 canon await not so patiently for the second part of the Remake saga, Rebirth, which is slated for a winter 2023-24 release. And finally, we reach the near future. In 2015, Yoshi P was finishing up the first expansion for Final Fantasy XIV, Heavensward. He was approached to make the next numbered Final Fantasy game, 16. He understood why he was asked, because the main series team was focusing on 7 Remake, but he knew he needed to make a healthy balance between his ongoing work on 14 and his upcoming work on 16. Thus, he created a planning team made up of himself, co-director Kazutoyo Miyahiro, and lead designer Mitsutoshi Gondai. Soon, co-director Hiroshi Takai was also brought on board, and once patch 3.4 for 14 was released, and both Takai and Gondai had found trustworthy replacements to focus on 14's second expansion, Stormblood, production for 16 went into full swing. Takai sought to make a game with action-based combat that was also easy to use, and a mature, dark fantasy narrative with difficult themes. Yoshi P also wanted to make a game that turned away from design penchants associated with Japanese RPGs, such as an anime art style and a focus on teenagers saving the world. Yoshi P would conduct his own surveys within the community and ultimately find a fairly stark division between fans of action and turn-based combat. He decided on action combat and acknowledged that, while it might be a polarizing decision, trying to incorporate different mechanics to please everybody would only end up with a half-baked game. But there was a bit of a problem. No team within Square Enix, outside of the Kingdom Hearts team, was familiar with action combat design. So Yoshi P personally headhunted one specific person, Ryota Suzuki of Capcom, who had an incredible amount of experience with games that were renowned for their combat, including, but not limited to, Capcom vs. SNK 2, Onimusha Dawn of Dreams, Devil May Cry 4, Super Street Fighter 4, Dragon's Dogma, Monster Hunter World, and Devil May Cry 5. In all of these games, Suzuki's role varied from gameplay planning to fine-tuning to gameplay lead. Without a doubt, Suzuki's name was associated with good action combat, and Yoshi P brought him on as battle director. Then there was the music. With 16 being developed by Yoshi P's Creative Business Unit 3 team, it also meant bringing on the famed composer of 14, Masayoshi Soken, who had only been gaining popularity and admiration from the players of 14 for his fantastic scores for every single expansion, praised for his versatility and ability to draw emotions out of a scene with his music. Final Fantasy XVI is set for a worldwide release on June 22, 2023. According to Yoshi P, it would take an act of God, such as a meteor striking Square HQ, to delay the game. So let's cross our fingers that no cosmic calamities are interested in throwing a wrench into things until after that date. Beyond that, who knows where the franchise will go. Yoshi P and team will probably want to go back to focusing on 14 again for a bit, but with the original Final Fantasy team focused on the 7 Remakes saga, which includes a third and final game that will probably release in 2027 to make the original game's 30th anniversary, that'll leave us with a pretty big gap to fill before they move on and release a new project as well. So who's to say Yoshi P's team won't do 17 in the meantime? Of course, it's hard to say this early on, so this is only speculation on my part. Regardless, the future of Final Fantasy looks as fascinating as ever, with 16, 7 Rebirth, and the next 14 expansion all looking to drop within a 1-year span. Longtime fans will be enjoying a feast for the ages. Perhaps we're entering a second golden age for the franchise that is long overdue. Only time will tell. Now that the lengthy history lesson preamble is complete, it's time to dive directly into the core of the video. What makes a mainline Final Fantasy entry a real Final Fantasy game? It's an argument that's popped up every time a new installment is announced, and gradually becomes more and more heated as the game's marketing campaign ramps up, revealing more gameplay, eventually reaching a head when it's clear as day that the game will not be turn-based. Of course, that's just the mechanical side of the discussion. There's been a lot of contention, historically speaking, when a Final Fantasy game also doesn't return to its medieval fantasy roots either. Setting is the other half of this discussion, and there seems to be just as much, if not more, misunderstandings about this as there are about gameplay. So, where do I stand on all this? I've made it fairly clear that I think the idea of a real Final Fantasy game is pretty ridiculous, but why? Before I get into it, I want to make it clear that this section of the video is where I voice my own thoughts on the matter. It's strictly my own opinion. Again, I'm not trying to force anyone to like anything. If you dislike any Final Fantasy for any reason, I'm not trying to change your mind on that. I am only against the concept of a dividing line that separates real or true Final Fantasy from the others. You're more than free to not really enjoy action combat or non-medieval fantasy settings. I am only arguing that Final Fantasies that do not include those things should not be excluded from being considered true Final Fantasy titles, especially based on arbitrary criteria that probably doesn't even stay consistent from person to person. So, to summarize my thoughts here and now before we go into the details, there's more to a Final Fantasy game than just the combat and setting. The story, characters, art, and music are important too. This is why Final Fantasy grabbed me and continues to grab me, even when an individual game doesn't completely meet my expectations. They always at least tried to have every aspect of every game at its best. Even in the cases where the execution of some things were just not up to snuff, you could at least see the idea they were going for. When it comes down to it, I think change or attempting new ideas is the spirit of Final Fantasy, and is the one ultimate requirement, if any exists, needed for a mainline Final Fantasy game to feel like a true one. If an entry has the ambition to at least attempt a unique idea, either narratively or mechanically, then that's good enough for me. As a true anthology series where every numbered game is its own story, I think it's natural for each game to have its own world and mechanics too. As a true anthology series, it doesn't and shouldn't have to commit to one particular setting or gameplay system 100% of the time, because I think that would be counterproductive to the fact that it's an anthology. Tweaks that range from minuscule to drastic from game to game should be expected, if not encouraged, for a franchise like this. Change is natural for it, and I think that should be embraced. If you did take the time to listen through my history lesson, then you've probably taken notice of one thing I was doing regularly throughout. I wasn't being very subtle about it. I was constantly emphasizing major differences in games compared to their predecessors, both mechanical and narrative. They didn't seem like particularly huge changes when going from game to game, but when you stand at the 10th, 12th, or 16th game and look back at everything that had passed all at once, the changes seem much more drastic. So let's go over this piece by piece. Let's first talk about gameplay mechanics. How have they changed over the years? It didn't take long at all for significant transformations to appear on this front. Final Fantasy II already made a significant shift by completely getting rid of normal experience points and levels in favor of a situational character development system where party members' stats increased depending on how they fought. Then 3 comes along and brings levels back, but also introduces the first iteration of the job system. Now, so far, nothing's really changed the combat itself. It's still firmly in traditional turn-based territory, which is what the older Final Fantasy fans know and love. However, the first truly gargantuan shift happens in 4 with the ATB system. As I mentioned in the history lesson, ATB facilitates not just turn-based combat, but real-time combat too, though in a literal sense. It was still command-based gameplay through menu navigation, yes, but I think this was the writing on the wall that action combat would be a system they would adopt eventually. Hear me out. Setting the ATB to active mode means time will always pass regardless of what you're doing in battle. So if you aren't fast enough at menu navigating, the enemy can overwhelm you with constant attacks. I know it's a very literal interpretation of the phrase that most people don't picture in their head when they hear real-time combat, but for all intents and purposes, the ATB system, when set to active mode, was real-time combat, and it's been available since Final Fantasy IV. Of course, the most obvious response to that is, well, just because it's an option doesn't mean everyone played that way. Plenty still played on wait mode for a real turn-based experience, and that is true. In fact, I tend to prefer wait mode when playing through ATB Final Fantasies too. But Final Fantasy has always had a reputation for attempting to get the most out of the technology available to the development team at the time without sacrificing the scope of anything else. I know the ATB system was not the hack-and-slash gameplay that would come along later, but I think it represents the limit they were willing to temporarily settle at before video game technology advanced enough to facilitate something with more action without cutting back on other aspects of the game. What I'm trying to say is, I think ATB definitely planted the seed that Final Fantasy could make the full transition one day, and perhaps even suggested that this was just the way it was always bound to go. I know turn-based is very often associated with RPGs, especially when games have their mechanics derived from tabletop games. But action combat in video games have existed for the genre for almost just as long. In fact, the very first RPG that Square ever published back in 1984, predating Final Fantasy I by just under 3.5 years, was Dragon Slayer, developed by Nihon Falcom, which had real-time action gameplay. By today's standards, it isn't very easy on the eyes, sure, but it helped set the foundation for the action RPG genre for years to come. I've seen people wonder, if the ATB system worked so well for so long, then why not continue it? Now, this isn't a question I could definitively answer since I'm not a developer at Square, but I do know that Yoshi P has a couple answers for it. Back in July 2022, he stated, "For several console generations now, all character expressions can be done in real time. Actions such as press the trigger and your character will shoot a gun, can now be easily expressed without going through a command system. It's now common for gamers younger than me to love such games. As a result, it seems that it does not make sense to go through a command prompt, such as battle, to make a decision during a battle. Basically, the decision to stick to real-time combat is because it's just what the majority of gamers seem to prefer nowadays, especially since this combat is more capable of technical nuance now than ever before. For many, it just seems silly to continue with menu navigation when you have the willingness and capability of making and investing real-time combat system. And it doesn't stop there. Yoshi P offered another reason the month earlier, this time about how turn-based combat can clash with realistic graphics, stating, "I understand that there are a lot of fans out there that do wish for a return to the turn-based battle system, but, and it pains me to say this, I'm really sorry that we're not going to be doing that for this iteration of the series. As someone who was raised on turn-based, command-based role-playing games, I fully understand their appeal and understand what's great about them. But one thing that we found recently is that as graphics get better and better, and as characters become more realistic and more photoreal, is that the combination of that realism with the very unreal sense of turn-based commands doesn't really fit together. You have this kind of strange gap that emerges. Some people are fine with it. They're fine with having these realistic characters in this unreal type of system. But then, on the other hand, there are people that just can't get over it. I mean, if you have a character holding a gun, why can't you just press the button to have the gun fire? Why do you need a command in there? And so it becomes a question of not right or wrong, but it becomes a question of preferences for each different player. When asked to create Final Fantasy XVI by the higher-ups in the company, one of their orders was to fully maximize the use of the technology. And so, when making that decision, we thought that the direction of taking in that full action was the way to do that. And when deciding whether, okay, are we going to go turn-based or are we going to go action, I made the decision to go action. Personally, I do see where Yoshi P is coming from, and I do not necessarily disagree with him. It does seem weird for very realistic looking characters on screen in a game running on a sophisticated engine capable of extremely deep mechanical action combat to just stand there and wait for orders. But as he said, it's a personal preference at the end of the day. And he was told by his own bosses to max out the technology they were using, and action combat was the best way to do it. This goes back to my opinion that Final Fantasy games always tried to do that with the considerations of the technological limits at the time. If I'm being completely honest here, I think the balls-to-the-wall action we've been seeing in recent games has been the dream they've been chasing since the day Advent Children came out in 2005. The entire second half of that movie was flashy action sequence with physics-defying tricks and attacks, and Cloud, the main character, performing insane jumps, taking down Bahamut on his own, and cutting buildings in half. And you can't pull off stuff like that in a turn-based game unless you add animations that constantly take control away from the player for obscene amounts of time. They would basically be mid-fight cutscenes and not actual gameplay you participate in. This opinion of mine only got stronger once Dissidia came out 4 years later, and managed to show signs of getting closer to that dream, but in a one-on-one format. The only way to achieve this kind of grandiose combat in a mainline game with great controls was to adopt a sort of Devil May Cry or even Dragon's Dogma style system, which is what they ultimately did once they got a battle director for 14 who worked on Devil May Cry and Dragon's Dogma, among other titles praised for their combat. Before that, Final Fantasy XV could have gotten it right if the combat just felt better to control, especially on the ground. The best fight in that game was with Aranea, where she and Noctis were constantly teleporting in midair. That shit was rad as fuck. So, again, I honestly feel that this type of combat was inevitable for a while now, at least 2 decades, but possibly even 3. It became crystal clear once we entered the PlayStation 2 era, where Final Fantasy X came out with the CTB turn-based system, which I personally like more than the ATB. Then every single player game after that gradually became more and more action-based. 12 had the active dimension battle system, which eliminated random encounters and a separate battle screen, while also being basically a spreadsheet simulator where you gave detailed orders to AI-controlled party members via the Gambit mechanic. Its enhanced re-release even included a turbo mode to speed up the game dramatically. 13 had the Command Synergy battle system, which brought back the ATB, but it functioned a lot differently than before, opening the door up for chain attacks. It also had paradigms, which were basically jobs that granted characters abilities relating to whatever job they were using, and you were actually able to switch between those jobs mid-fight. 15 had the active battle system, which was basically regular action gameplay with, unfortunately, mediocre controls. But 7 Remake remedied that issue and offered a much more engaging and satisfying system while still managing to implement a form of ATB and menu navigation. And while this series is a bit of a sore spot for some Final Fantasy fans, and I'll get to that later, Kingdom Hearts was right alongside Final Fantasy this whole era, developing its own form of flashy combat action too, with some games in the series receiving particular praise for it. The technology was improving all around, and it was slowly getting easier to reach that dream of massive, hyperkinetic, super flashy, city-scale fights. The question to ask now is, how long will Final Fantasy stay action-based after this? And honestly, that's a fair thing to wonder. If 16 truly represents the pinnacle they want to reach with action combat, I imagine they would want to stay there for at least a few more games, with some mechanical tweaks and additions that make future installments unique in their own right. I would not anticipate 17 or 18 to play exactly the same, of course, but I expect the foundation to be similar. Maybe they'll bring the hybrid system of 7 Remake over too. Who knows? If mainline Final Fantasy ever goes back to being turn-based, I imagine it would be for a title that deliberately tries to keep its combat sequences a bit closer to the ground. But combat is only one part of what made these games so good. 4 marked the beginning of the most famous and beloved era of the franchise, which I think is one reason why people are so desperate to hang on to command-based gameplay. A lot of Final Fantasy fans, especially those around 30 years old and up, look back at 4 through 9 as being the golden age of the mainline series, and I think they associate that high quality with command-based gameplay. But those games also had incredible stories, incredible characters, incredible art direction, and incredible music. So boiling a Final Fantasy experience down to just the battles is very dismissive of everything else that goes into these games. It's also very easy to have a bias for the ATB era when the era that followed was full of experimental systems that were hit or miss. As I said though, an anthology series should always be open to change, both small and large. And as an anthology series, the one thing it's been consistently married to is the idea of totally different worlds and characters with each new game. This leads us to our other point of contention in the discussion of real Final Fantasy: setting. For a long period of time, specifically 1 through 6 and a few more scattered around after that, Final Fantasy was associated with medieval fantasy settings. Knights, swords, castles, and magic, that kind of thing. It's only natural a series initially inspired by the likes of wizardry and Dungeons & Dragons would default to such worlds at the start. RPGs and medieval settings were basically one and the same. The change in setting was not as gradual as the change in gameplay. When 6 came around, it was a bit of a jump, going from medieval fantasy in 5 before it to a slightly steampunk-inspired industrial world. But then 7 released later and truly abandoned the medieval traditions of the franchise. Cars, machine guns, tanks, helicopters, energy reactors, robots, mecha, and advanced biological experiments, the world of 7 was undeniably modern, with only few hints of medieval presence scattered around, like continued inclusion of magic and sword usage. Of course, 7 would go down in history as one of the greatest games of all time, And while some people did hate the departure from medieval fantasy and the beginning of modern fantasy, it was also seen as a breath of fresh air for many, especially when the story itself was extremely deep and engrossing and took wholehearted advantage of its setting. But as time went on and we entered the experimental and action era of the franchise, the modern or sci-fi fantasy worlds were starting to overstay their welcome, especially with 13 and 15. However, I don't believe the divisiveness of either of those games has their settings as the core of the issue. If anything, it's their own respective narratives, characters, and implementation of their settings that are the problems. 13's frequently criticized linearity and hit-or-miss cast members would have made the game one of the weakest entries in the series regardless of the world it took place in. And in 15's case, the poor combat controls and open world that didn't really justify its size wouldn't have suddenly become good if it had a medieval setting either. Taking aim at these games because of their settings does not attack the actual source of their weaknesses. Yet some people feel like all problems would be magically resolved if the sci-fi shit was finally taken out of the franchise again, which is an egregious misinterpretation of Final Fantasy's narrative history. The biggest point to make here is the fact that the Final Fantasy franchise has never, ever been completely 100% faithful to the medieval setting. Hell, Final Fantasy VII almost took place in fucking New York City, a very real location. And that was back when Sakaguchi, the father of Final Fantasy, still had a fairly active part in development for the franchise. If he didn't consider medieval settings a necessity for this series, then why should anyone else? What makes these stories so memorable is often their intricate and sometimes sudden implementation of science fiction concepts. Space travel, time travel, dimension hopping, and advanced technology from lost civilizations, to name a few. Don't believe me? Well, consider this. Final Fantasy I included an important plot device in the form of a time loop, which the Warriors of Light needed to exploit in order to defeat Garland. Also, there's a location in the game called the Flying Fortress, which turns out to be a fucking space station powered not by magic, but by hyper-advanced technology. And it's inhabited by robots, including the game's superboss, Warmech. And this is the original NES version I am talking about, not any of the later remasters. This is the first Final Fantasy game, period. And let's not forget the airship, which has been a major mode of transportation for almost every single game too, again starting with the first. This series has never truly been married to the medieval setting, not even on day one. Sort of like how ATB planted the seed of action combat years before they made the switch. The franchise has always had a seed of science fiction within. It was only a matter of time before we got games that went all the way with it. The insanity of the scope of these games leads me to my next point. A strange one that I feel stupid for even needing to bring up, but way too many people insist on mentioning this man when they see something in this franchise that they disapprove of, and it is completely unwarranted, not just 50 or 80% of the time, but damn near 100. Yes, I am talking about the unfortunately controversial and constantly blamed Tetsuya Nomura. I'm not a particularly big fan of the guy. I like many of his contributions to Final Fantasy, yes, but I do not have any special attachment to Kingdom Hearts like I do Final Fantasy. In fact, the main reason I even played Kingdom Hearts 3 was to just get enough closure to finally sever my shackles from that series. But I'll be frank about this. If you've ever pointed the finger at Nomura for any problem relating to Final Fantasy when he did not have a sole directing or writing credit on the game you're talking about, and he never does, then I strongly doubt your understanding of his contributions to, and your general literacy of, the franchise as a whole. It's one thing to dislike him over how he's directed the Kingdom Hearts series, or even how he designed certain characters, which is fine. You're allowed to dislike him for those reasons. But tossing the blame at him for things that he literally has no power over or involvement in is just plain ridiculous. I remember when Stranger of Paradise was announced and the game's cheesy dialogue was revealed to the world, and some people took to social media to pin the problem on Nomura because his name was listed in that trailer beneath the role of concept, creative producer, and character design, even though the names of the writer, director, and producer were also on the same frame. The incessant whining about Nomura has proved to me, more so than the rigid checklist of gameplay and setting criteria I've been talking about, that Final Fantasy exists in a lot of people's minds as a very nebulous entity without shape or color. And when a specific person's name pops up often enough in association with it, they become the face of that entity. It's frustrating, and it's not just because the fact Nomura is blamed, it's because of the things themselves that he is blamed for. I think what turned Nomura into a punching bag for misdirected ire was the handling of Final Fantasy Versus 13 in tandem with the progression of the Kingdom Hearts series. When Versus 13 was first announced, it was actually quite highly anticipated. Kingdom Hearts 2 had just come out not too long ago and received very positive reception. The series hadn't been derided for its confusing, overarching plotlines yet. The idea of a darker Final Fantasy title as part of a sub-series relating to 13 was interesting to say the least. But development continued to stall, and we began to hear less and less news about it. Months turned into years, and it became more and more obvious that Versus 13 barely existed at all when it was first announced. And simultaneously, Kingdom Hearts was beginning to develop its divisive reputation thanks to a very scattered narrative spread across multiple platforms, forcing fans to own a PlayStation 2, PSP, and 3DS if they wanted the bulk of the canon story. These two unfortunately timed things working together made Nomura look like an incompetent asshole who couldn't focus on any single project. But the Versus 13 situation was more complicated than that. His team was split between making progress on Versus 13 while also helping with the development of 13 in their spare time. And it wasn't until 13 was released that Versus 13 entered full-time production. But that did not last long, because the game was originally going to be made on the Crystal Tools engine for the PlayStation 3. But in 2011, Square Enix was presented with the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One and decided to further alter the course of the game, leading to the PS3 version being abandoned for easier development on the new upcoming consoles, but with Square's new and unproven engine, Luminous, instead of Crystal Tools. And of course, this total redirection of technical specifications led to little actual content being made for the game. And in 2012, Nomura was taken off the project, sent to focus on Kingdom Hearts, and Hajime Tabata was brought in to more or less reboot development with what little the original team had the opportunity to make. Final Fantasy XV's troubled history is not something to throw exclusively at Nomura's lap. It was a complicated situation where everyone in power was doing something wrong until Tabata had to come in and clean up a mess that was building up for half a decade. It was not a game that was in development for 10 years. If anything, it was in development for about 5 years, somehow stretched across 10, but only 4 of those years were spent making the actual Final Fantasy XV that came out. A lot of people look at the game and simply see one of the weaker entries of the mainline series, but I see it as a game with a borderline cursed development cycle that was lucky to not come out in a significantly worse shape, if not lucky to come out at all. Sadly, the damage was already done, and Nomura was associated with all negative connotations of 15's development, and it ruined his reputation among a lot of fans. If Nomura's name is within a country mile of a Final Fantasy game that has some sort of perceived flaw that could be associated with him, specifically character designs or thematic concepts portrayed with the grandiosity, then he's going to be pointed at as the culprit, accused of bringing his Kingdom Hearts bullshit into Final Fantasy. This is probably going to hurt some very pedantic fanboys to hear, but Final Fantasy was already doing Kingdom Hearts bullshit before Kingdom Hearts even existed. I already mentioned sci-fi concepts popping up in games, and that's occurred many times, often very suddenly at the end of them. You already know about the time loop and space station in Final Fantasy I, but when does it get even crazier? Well, how about Final Fantasy VIII, where the story transforms from a group of teenage mercenaries trying to take down an evil sorceress, to a full-on conflict between mercenary academies, to space travel in order to take down a different, stronger evil sorceress, and watch a massive teardrop made of monsters fall from the moon because that's where monsters come from in that universe, to time traveling in order to stop another different and even stronger evil sorceress. Yes, this all happens over the course of one game. And I didn't even mention how it uses the game's own character development system, called Junction, as an in-universe excuse for giving the main characters amnesia. This game came out in 1999, 3 years before Kingdom Hearts released, and 1 year before Kingdom Hearts even began development. Now, some people might dismiss my choice of using 8 as an example, because it's a slightly divisive entry in the series, and because it does feature Nomura in the credits simply as a character designer, not a writer, who would be Kazushige Nojima. So, how about the very next game, 9, which was more well received and doesn't feature Nomura's name in any noteworthy role. For the vast majority of the story, 9 is actually a very straightforward, no-nonsense journey about a group of bandits kidnapping a princess and trying to stop a war. Until the last several hours happen where a parallel world is discovered and an antagonist who we didn't know existed before that point reveals himself as an inhabitant of that parallel world and used advanced bioengineering to create an army of humanoids to act as vessels for souls. Then the main party follows the original main antagonist into the past to the origin of life in the universe, where they fight him and the physical embodiment of death, who was not present in the story at all until it suddenly appears in the middle of the final battle. Yeah. Again, Nomura has no involvement in this game. In fact, 9 was written and co-produced by Sakaguchi, and was the last mainline Final Fantasy title he made personal contributions to. For 10, 11, and 10-2, he was an executive producer who worked from more of a distance, before leaving Square in 2003. All of this Nomura blame reached a peak once Final Fantasy VII Remake came out. A painful amount of people pointed and continue to point at him for the very grandiose ending, resorting to the Kingdom Hearts bullshit complaint I mentioned earlier. Which is obviously ridiculous when Final Fantasy games have always had a habit of raising the stakes or introducing crazy concepts and huge set pieces near the end of their games. Treating him like a saboteur who wants to ruin the legacy of Final Fantasy VII is insane, especially once you learn about how much he actually contributed to the original game beyond just some art. The death of Aerith, one of the most famous scenes in video game history, was his idea. A man with such a meaningful connection to the original would not be trying to ruin anything. In fact, he has such a love and sense of preservation for the story of Final Fantasy VII that he's often the one trying to protect it from bad ideas in compilation content. In Dengeki PlayStation issue 396, it was revealed that Kitase was directly in charge of the Zack vs Sephiroth fight at Nibelheim in Crisis Core, and wanted to somehow incorporate Jenova into the battle, but it was Nomura who had to step in and tell him it would conflict with the original game too much. Furthermore, there are several flash-forwards scattered around Remake, but there was supposed to be very few, and many of them were actually sneaked into the game without Nomura's approval. If you don't like Remake's ending, that's fine, but pinning the issue on one man is unreasonable when there were several team leads, including producer Kitase, who was the director of the original game, lead writer Nojima, who is also the lead writer for the original as well, and 2 co-directors, Motomu Toriyama and Naoki Hamaguchi, the latter of whom will be the sole director of the upcoming Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Some people might dig in their heels and, in complete disregard of anything proving otherwise, say Nomura must have had final say in everything because he's the creative director of the Remake saga. But resorting to suggestions that he must be some kind of tyrant is not a compelling argument supported by any real evidence. He, along with Kitase and Nojima, constantly talk about how they communicate with each other and seek one another's approval for things. Besides, Nomura almost certainly does not even have the power to lead with an iron fist anyway, because Creative Business Unit 1 is not his team to boss around in that manner. He's a director of that team, yes, but Kitase is the leader of the entire unit because Kitase is a member of Square's board of directors, and Nomura is not. Just like how Naoki Yoshida, aka Yoshi P, is also a member of the board of directors and is the leader of Unit 3. The only unit not led by a board member is 4, which is led by Hirokazu Nishikado, who is still credited as an executive officer, so his position in the company is still very high. Nomura isn't some infallible god within Square, he's just one of the most reliable and recognizable directors they have, and thus, he gets attached to a lot of projects, with his involvement ranging from just character designer to full-on director. And the final point that I want to bring up is the father of Final Fantasy himself, Mr. Hironobu Sakaguchi. If there's one person on this entire planet who would have any amount of authority on what a real Final Fantasy game is, it would be him. After all, he's the one who directed, wrote, produced, or a combination of those, all the classic titles, including the ones that the most hardcore purists love. So what does he think about the constant and oftentimes dramatic changes, mechanical and narrative, the series has seen over time? From Final Fantasy 1 to 11 and 10-2, he was there every step of the way before his eventual departure from Square. And there were many, many big changes in that time frame, from traditional turn-based combat to the ATB system to an MMO, from medieval settings to futuristic ones and back, from sprites to 3D models, from voiceless to voiced, Sakaguchi has seen it all. So how does the father of Final Fantasy feel about it? Quite frankly, I think the answer should be obvious. Remember when I said Final Fantasy VII almost took place in New York City? Well, guess whose idea that originally was? It was Sakaguchi's. He was in charge of writing the initial plot and setting the foundation for the narrative, and that's what he came up with. A Final Fantasy that not only did not take place in a medieval fantasy setting, it took place in a very real location. And Final Fantasy XI being an MMO, also Sakaguchi's idea, particularly after being impressed by EverQuest at the time. Personally, I think that should spell things out enough, but just to be extra clear, Sakaguchi had some things to say about Final Fantasy X before it came out. That even though he had his own concerns about the transition from 2D to 3D environments, voice acting, and real-time storytelling, he still felt that the success of the Final Fantasy franchise can be attributed to constantly challenging the development team to try new things. And, as the cherry on top, what do you think is one of Sakaguchi's most time-consuming hobbies right this very moment? It's playing Final Fantasy XIV. What started as mere curiosity turned into full-blown addiction as Sakaguchi absolutely tore through 14's entire main scenario quest in only a month, praising every little reference to past games along the way. And when he got caught up, he didn't put the game down. He established his own free company called Square, and he began tackling savage raids, some of the most difficult content in the entire game. While making this video, he still posts screenshots of his regular sessions to Twitter almost daily. If the creator of the series doesn't think that a game needs specific gameplay or setting requirements to be considered a real Final Fantasy, then why should such rigid criteria be forced by random nobodies online? Not only this, but he's met with Yoshi P personally and has an extremely high opinion of him, and greatly values the appreciation he has for the older games. I've been a Final Fantasy fan for well over 2 decades now, the vast majority of my life, and I've been an internet user for almost that length of time as well, for better and for worse. So when I say I've seen all of these subjects discussed a lot, I really do mean it. I can still recall some of the oldest arguments I remember seeing. People hating Final Fantasy X because it was the most linear game in the series at the time, and they thought voice acting ruined the story. People hating Final Fantasy XI because they felt that the mere fact it was an MMO was spitting in the face of the franchise's predominantly single-player history. People hating Final Fantasy XII for not having random encounters. Seriously. The arbitrary bullshit just keeps going and going. Ridiculous criteria for what a real Final Fantasy game should be, according to fans who say they've hated the series for the last several titles, yet they still insist on being the people that Square should pander to with the next one. Believe me when I say this video is not a response to things I've seen only recently. It's a response to things I've been seeing for almost 20 years across many corners of the internet. From the old GameFAQs message boards to several smaller private forums to modern-day social media, I've seen the discussion continue to persist, and I've felt the same way the entire time. Final Fantasy is not embodied solely by medieval fantasy, nor turn-based combat. Final Fantasy is constant change. New and unique narratives and gameplay systems, connected only by the tiniest threads that maintain the spirit of adventure, the appeal of beautiful worlds, and the charisma of nuanced characters. Final Fantasy is not a franchise of complacency kept afloat by fans who reluctantly accept more of the same. It's an anthology of many experiences, not shackled down to any specific formula. Have they all worked? No. But the ones that did have earned their spot in history as some of the greatest games ever made. And I guess that's everything I have to say on the matter. This ended up being one hell of a video and much longer than I anticipated. I considered, many times over the course of writing this script, splitting it up into parts, but I ultimately decided that everything worked better as a long, cohesive whole. As someone who has always embraced Final Fantasy's penchant for constant change and evolution, I've had strong feelings about the conversation of what makes a Final Fantasy a real Final Fantasy, so I've decided to put it all in this one big essay, as you can see. And I've had my work cut out for me. It probably goes without saying, but I am looking forward to the future of this series, near and far. For now though, I eagerly await the release of Final Fantasy XVI, and I'm crossing my fingers that it's as good as I hope it is. If you've made it this far into the video, then thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.